I wasn't looking for directional orientation when I started this investigation. I was originally researching the acoustic properties of 19th century civic buildings, train stations, courthouses, exhibition halls, trying to understand why their interiors carried sound so differently from anything built after 1920. That was the original question. A simple architectural curiosity. The kind of thing that feels almost academic until it stops feeling academic entirely. I had spent several weeks cataloging the interior geometry of these structures, measuring the curvature of their domed ceilings, the depth of their barrel vaults, the specific angle at which their clear-story windows admitted light. And somewhere inside that process, I noticed something I had not been looking for at all. Something that had nothing to do with acoustics. Something that, once I registered it consciously, I could not unregister. The buildings were facing the same direction, not approximately the same direction, not coincidentally aligned, the same direction across countries, across continents, across decades of supposed independent construction. The primary facades, the grand entrances, the ceremonial fronts, the faces these buildings show to the world, were oriented with a consistency that no urban planning theory I am aware can adequately explain. I pulled more examples, then more. I cross-referenced surveying records, city planning maps from the 1840s through the 1890s, and old photographic archives. And every time I thought I had found an exception, a closer examination revealed it was not an exception at all. The alignment held, and the moment I understood that it held, truly held, across geography and culture and official historical narrative, the official explanations began to collapse. Let me begin with what the photographs actually show, because this is where the evidence becomes tangible rather than theoretical. In the archive of the Imperial Russian Geographical Society, held in St. Petersburg, there exists a series of surveying photographs taken between 1862 and 1889. These are not amateur images. They were produced using wet collodion glass plate negatives, a process with specific technical limitations that make deliberate manipulation essentially impossible at the scale we would need to dismiss them. The grain structure of these photographs, the silver halide distribution across the emulsion, predated the technology to fake them in any meaningful way. What these photographs document is the orientation of civic structures across the Volga Basin, post offices, administrative halls, what the contemporary labels call municipal reception buildings, and when you plot the primary entrance axis of each structure onto a modern compass overlay, the alignment is not random. It clusters between 14 and 18 degrees east of true north, with a statistical consistency that a random distribution could not produce. I am not estimating this. I am reading it from the original surveying data that accompanied those photographs, data that was apparently considered mundane enough to survive an archive without anyone finding it interesting. Across the Atlantic, in the photographic holdings of the Smithsonian Institution's National Museum of American History, there are construction-era daguerreotypes of public buildings in Cincinnati, St. Louis, and New Orleans, all constructed between 1845 and 1878, all supposedly product of independent municipal planning committees working without reference to one another. The facades in these images face the same orientation as the Russian structures, not within a few degrees, within the same narrow band. The shadows fall correctly for a northeastern exposure. The morning light catches the same decorative cornices at the same angle. The grain match what I found in the Russian photographs, not in photographic chemistry, but in what the light was doing to the stone. Now, the official explanation for building orientation is practical. You orient a building based on street grids, solar gain, prevailing wind, the existing topography of the plot. These are sensible variables. An urban planner in 1860 Cincinnati had no reason to care about what an urban planner in 1860s Kazan was doing. They were operating under completely different civic traditions, different climates, different religious orientations. The Orthodox tradition in Russia, the Protestant civic tradition in Ohio. And yet the primary facade acts as a line to within 3 degrees of each other. I want to be precise about what I am claiming here, because precision matters. I am not claiming that every single building of this era faces this direction. I am claiming that the ceremonial civic structures, the buildings with the grand colonnades, the rusticated plinths, the large-scale symmetrical compositions that historians now group loosely under the label Beaux-Arts, or Second Empire, or various other stylistic categories. These buildings, specifically, show this orientation pattern with consistency that the practical explanation does not account for. When I raised this observation with a professor of architectural history, whose work I respect, he said, and I am paraphrasing, because I did not record the conversation, that this was likely the result of pattern books, that 19th century architects worked from shared European design manuals, and that similar design conventions naturally produced similar results. But pattern books do not specify compass orientation. They specify proportion, molding profiles, column spacing. They do not tell you which direction to face the door. And that is the part of this that the pattern book explanation cannot touch. Once you see it, you can't unsee it. The pattern repeats with unsettling precision. I want to take you across several continents now, because the geographical distribution of this orientation is not incidental to the argument. It is the argument. In Buenos Aires, the civic buildings constructed between 1862 and 1898 along the Avenida de Mayo and the surrounding administrative quarter share the same northeast-facing primary axis. The Argentine architectural tradition of this period drew heavily from French and Italian precedents, which is unremarkable. What is remarkable is that the specific site plans of these buildings, held in the Archivo General de la Nación, show that in multiple cases the street grid was modified to accommodate the building's desired orientation, rather than the building being oriented to fit the existing street grid. Someone wanted these buildings facing a specific direction badly enough to adjust the streets around them. In Delhi, under British colonial administration, the civic structures built between the 1850s and the 1890s in the areas surrounding what is now Connaught Place show the same orientation. The British colonial architectural program in India was deliberate and politically loaded. These buildings were instruments of imperial communication, and yet their orientation matches not the local solar or religious conventions of the subcontinent, but the same northeastern axis found in Russia and Ohio and Argentina. Moved to Melbourne, Australia. The public buildings of the CBD constructed in the gold rush era of the 1850s and 1860s, the State Library of Victoria, the General Post Office, the Old Treasury Building, all orient their ceremonial facades within that same narrow directional band. Melbourne was a young city being built rapidly by people who had no centuries of local tradition to draw on. They were making choices fresh, and the choices they made aligned inexplicably with choices being made simultaneously on the other side of the planet. The specific measurements here matter. I am not talking about a loose quadrant of the compass. I am talking about a band of roughly 4 degrees of arc, centered around 16 degrees east of north, that recurs across 6 continents in the same century. The probability of that being random is not something I can calculate precisely, but I can tell you it is not something a statistician would dismiss. The question I keep returning to is not how this was achieved. The question is why. Why would builders in cities that had no communication with one another, operating under different climates and different religious traditions and different political systems, converge on the same directional orientation for their most important structures? Who were they built for? The answer, or at least the shape of an answer, appears on maps that most people alive today have never looked at. In European cartography from the 17th and 18th centuries, there is a territory marked on the maps of Central and Northern Asia that covers, depending on the map and the era, an area ranging from the Caspian Sea to the Pacific coast. It is labeled variously as Tartaria Magna, Grand Tartary, or simply Tartaria, and it is enormous. On some maps, it is the largest named political territory on the surface of the earth. I want to be careful about how I characterize this, because Tartaria appears in historical scholarship, and it is sometimes dismissed as simply a vague European label for the peoples of the steppe, a catch-all geographic descriptor with no political meaning. But that dismissal becomes impossible to ignore when you examine the cartographic record carefully. These maps do not depict Tartaria as a vague region in a way that early maps depicted terra incognita. They depict it with internal divisions, with named cities, with administrative subdivisions. The 1706 map by Guillaume Delisle, held in the Bibliothèque Nationale de France, shows Tartaria with a level of internal geographic specificity that does not suggest a vague label. It suggests knowledge of a functioning political entity, not a legend, not a myth, a territory that appears in detail on the official maps of European cartographic institutions for more than 2 centuries. And then, in the early 19th century, it stops appearing, not gradually, not renamed or reorganized the way the Holy Roman Empire was renamed or reorganized. It simply ceases to be on the maps. The territory is absorbed into the expanding Russian Empire on some maps, dissolved into vague regional designations on others. But the entity itself, the named, bounded, internally organized political territory called Tartaria, disappears from the cartographic record within a span of roughly 30 years. Not conquered in a documented series of campaigns, not transformed through a recorded political process, erased. And now I find myself looking at civic buildings in St. Petersburg and Buenos Aires and Delhi and Melbourne, all oriented to the same 16-degree axis, all built in the century immediately following Tartaria's disappearance from the maps, and the connection between these two facts becomes impossible to ignore. What if the orientation of these buildings was not a matter of local practical decision-making? What if it was a convention, a technical or ceremonial specification, carried forward from an older tradition, a tradition whose origin we are no longer permitted to trace? The historical record does not go silent on these buildings all at once. It goes silent in stages, and those stages follow a pattern that is itself revealing. The Cincinnati Daily Gazette, 1871, ran a piece describing the orientation of the newly completed Hamilton County Courthouse and noting, in passing, almost as an architectural curiosity, that the building's primary axis had been set by the supervising engineer rather than by the city planning committee, and that the engineer had referenced what the article called the established meridian of civic construction. I found this reference in a microfilm archive. The phrase established meridian of civic construction appears in that article and, as far as my research has been able to determine, nowhere else in surviving press record. Whoever used that phrase understood it as a known convention requiring no further explanation. Their reader, apparently, was expected to understand it too. The St. Petersburg Vedomosti, 1883, published a technical supplement on construction methods used in several new administrative buildings along the Nevsky Prospect. Buried in the 4th column of this supplement is a reference to what the text calls the standard orienting practice for buildings of the first class, described as distinct from the orienting practice for religious structures. No elaboration is given. It is referenced as a known quantity. The Buenos Aires La Prensa, 1889, in a lengthy architectural review of the new municipal buildings on the Avenida de Mayo, describes the orientation of the primary facades as conforming to what the reviewer calls the universal civic alignment. Again, with no elaboration, as though the reader would know what this meant. The Delhi Gazette, 1894, reporting on the completion of a new administrative hall in the Civil Lines District, notes that the building's entrance court had been oriented in accordance with the standard practice for structures of civic permanence. The phrase civic permanence is interesting. It implies a category. It implies there were structures of a different kind, oriented differently, and that the civic structures of permanent importance followed a specific rule. The Illustrated London News, 1896, in a survey of new public buildings across the empire, describes the orientation of several recently completed colonial civic structures and attributes their alignment to what it calls the received tradition of public architecture. Not the English tradition, not the classical tradition, the received tradition. Received from whom? It does not say. After 1920, these references stop. The photographs stop. The reports stop. The maps change. The new buildings being constructed in the same cities after the First World War do not follow this orientation, and no one writing about architecture in the 1920s and beyond seems to remember that there was ever convention to follow. The institutional record, from the Smithsonian to the British Museum to the archives of European geographical societies, treats the orientation as either unworthy of comment or simply invisible. The pattern is too consistent to ignore. Let me propose something that sounds absurd until you examine the evidence. What if these buildings were not oriented by local architects making independent practical decisions? What if they were oriented according to a global technical specification, a specification that required alignment with a specific directional reference point that was not true north, not magnetic north, and not solar orientation. There is a category of navigational and geodetic work from the 18th and 19th centuries that refers to something called a prime meridian of civilization, not the Greenwich meridian, which was only standardized in 1884, but an older conceptual meridian that various surveying traditions placed at different longitudes. If a civilization with advanced geodetic capability had established a prime directional reference point, a zero bearing from which all civic alignment was calculated, then buildings built according to that tradition in St. Petersburg, Buenos Aires, Delhi, and Melbourne would all share the same absolute orientation, regardless of local street grids or solar angles. Why would you align civic buildings to a global directional standard rather than local practical considerations? The answer that makes functional sense to me is signal, not electromagnetic signal. I am not proposing wireless communication through stone buildings. I mean something more like the signal of legitimacy. The way that medieval European cathedrals oriented their naves east-west was not primarily about sunlight. It was about alignment with a shared cosmological reference. It communicated membership in a tradition. It said, this building was built according to the same principles as the other buildings in the network. We are part of the same system. If Tartaria, as it appears on the pre-19th century maps, was a civilization with a defined geodetic tradition, a tradition that included civic building conventions, and if that tradition survived the erasure of the political entity itself, transmitted through engineers and surveyors who may not have fully understood what they were perpetuating, then the orientation pattern I am describing is exactly what you would expect to find. You would find becoming less consistent over time as the tradition fragmented. You would find it absent from religious buildings, which would follow their own local conventions. You would find it discussed in contemporary press as a known convention requiring no explanation, because the people doing the building still understood it as standard practice. And you would find it disappearing abruptly from the record at the same point that the last practitioners of the original tradition died without successors. This is what the evidence points to. Not aliens, not magic. A civilization with a global civic standard that was erased from official history, whose physical legacy we have been living inside without knowing what we were looking at. They don't debate it. That is perhaps the most telling thing I can report from the years I have spent trying to raise this question in serious research contexts. When I brought the orientation data, the specific measurements, the cross-reference surveying records, the newspaper references to historians of architecture, the response is not engagement. It is not even dismissal in the argumentative sense, where someone proposes a counter-explanation and defends it. The response is absence, a polite redirection toward accepted frameworks, a studied in curiosity that itself requires explanation. I presented a version of this orientation analysis to a conference panel on 19th century public architecture. The paper was not rejected on methodological grounds. It was not accepted and critiqued. It was returned without review with a note suggesting it might be better suited to a different kind of publication. I have heard similar account from others working in adjacent areas. Researchers examining the construction timeline anomalies, the tool mark evidence, the material composition questions. The institutional response is consistent across disciplines and countries. It's not active suppression. It's passive erasure. Consider what this means operationally. If you want to prevent a question from being asked, not through censorship, which creates martyrs and draws attention, but through the more elegant method of simply never acknowledging that the question exists, you would do exactly what I am describing. You would train new generations of architectural historians who never encounter the orientation data because it is never mentioned in the curriculum. You would file the surveying records in uncatalogued boxes in institutional archives where researchers with narrow search parameters would never find them. You would allow the newspaper references to survive on microfilm while never digitizing them, never indexing them, never citing them in the literature that shapes what future researchers believe is worth looking for. And the result, after a century of this passive management, is exactly what we have now, a generation of professionals who are not hiding something because they were told to hide it. They are simply incurious about a question that was never placed in front of them. The erasure is self-perpetuating. It does not need active maintenance because the culture of the disciplines does the maintenance automatically. When I have tried to discuss this in academic forums, the conversation does not get shut down. It simply gets redirected gently, persistently, toward questions that the discipline already knows how to answer. The questions it does not know how to answer are not refused. They are starved. There is one more category of physical evidence I want to address, because it bears directly on the question of who was using these buildings and how they were using them. In the collection of the Victoria and Albert Museum in London, there are a series of brass surveying instruments catalogued as 19th century English manufacture. Theodolites, primarily, and a category of instrument the museum labels direction-finding compasses of professional grade. These instruments are interesting for several reasons, but the one that concerns me here is their calibration markings. A standard compass of the 19th century is calibrated to magnetic north. A surveying theodolite is calibrated to true north, with correction factors for magnetic declination at the location of use. These instruments are calibrated to neither. Their zero bearing, the point marked as the primary directional reference, does not correspond to magnetic north at any location on the surface of the Earth, and does not correspond to true north. The museum catalog describes this as an anomaly of manufacture, suggesting the instruments may have been produced for experimental use or for a private client with unusual specifications. The catalog note runs to approximately 40 words. 40 words for instruments whose calibration implies either a manufacturing error of a very specific and consistent kind, or a directional reference system that is simply not the one we currently use. I found similar instruments, similarly calibrated, similarly dismissed in catalog notes, in the collection of the Deutsches Museum in Munich, the Musée des Arts et Métiers in Paris, and in two private auction catalogs from sales held in London in 1923 and 1931. In each case, the instruments were described as curiosities, anomalies, interesting examples of non-standard manufacture. In each case, the zero bearing of their calibration fell within the same narrow arc, the same 16-degree offset from true north that appears in facade orientations of the civic buildings across 6 continents. These instruments were not curiosities. They were professional tools calibrated to a professional standard, a standard that someone used to build the buildings I've been describing, and that someone else decided at some point in the early 20th century to reclassify as anomalous. And suddenly the orientation of the buildings isn't an anomaly anymore. It's confirmation. I come back, at the end of all of this, to where I started, to the buildings themselves. To the grand civic structures of the 19th century with their colonnaded facades and their barrel-vaulted interiors and their precise northeastern orientation. Standing in cities on 6 continents. Still standing in most cases. Still facing the direction they were built to face. Why would independent architects on different continents, working in different cultural traditions for different clients under different climates, converge on the same 4-degree arc of compass orientation for their most important structures? Why would the contemporary press of the 1870s and 1880s and 1890s reference this orientation as the established meridian, the standard orienting practice, the universal civic alignment, and the received tradition, all without explanation, as though it were simply known? Why would the surveying instruments used to build these structures be calibrated to a directional reference that does not correspond to magnetic north or true north at any location on Earth? Why would those instruments be reclassified as manufacturing anomalies and quietly filed in museum collections rather than studied as evidence of coherent professional tradition? Why would all of this, the orientation data, the newspaper references, the instrument calibrations, the geodetic surveying records, converge on the same conclusion? And why would that conclusion be the one that no established academic institution will look directly at? Not coincidence, not random variation, not independent anomalies pattern, a pattern so consistent across geography and time and institutional record that the effort required to not see it as itself a kind of evidence. I don't have definitive answers, only questions. And the question I am left with, after everything I described, is not a technical one. It is a human one. What does it mean that we have been living inside the physical infrastructure of a civilization we were never told existed? What does it mean that the buildings which shape our civic life, the buildings where we conduct our legal proceedings, receive our mail, celebrate our public occasions, were oriented according to a standard we have forgotten, built for purposes we can no longer read, by hands connected to a tradition that was deliberately removed from a record. The buildings are still there. They still face the direction they were built to face. They have been facing it for 150 years, through wars and revolutions and the complete reorganization of the political world, quietly pointing in a direction that nobody official will explain. Whatever was known about why they faced that way, whatever tradition, whatever specification, whatever understanding of the world produced that 16-degree bearing, that knowledge is gone, or it was taken, and the stone remains.